Hello, this is Dr. Esa again, and welcome back to the series God and Money in the Bible. We will continue our New Testament section and start from Mark's Gospel. Since we don't have time to go through every passage, I will focus on two different themes. The first theme is discipleship and following Jesus. And the second one is our duties to God and authorities, and by implication also for the poor. So let's see what we can find. I hope you enjoy this video. Feel free also to comment on the below section if you have any questions or other passages that you're interested in learning about. Mark's Gospel can be divided into two separate sections, chapters 1 to 8, which is really about Jesus' glory and power to do miracles, and chapters 9 to 16, which focus on the cross and the fact that the disciples are to follow Jesus on the way to the cross, highlighting Jesus' suffering and the disciples' suffering. However, when we look at the poverty vocabulary, we can see that Mark only mentions the word pokos, or beggarly poverty, in his gospel. Poverty is, though, present throughout the gospel narrative, even though the specific vocabulary about the poor or poverty or beggars are explicit. We could see that already in the lifestyle of John the Baptist in the desert, and the crowds and the sick and the disabled and the unclean people who are constantly surrounding Jesus, and they're coming to him and almost feels like they're pestering him to the point of becoming a nuisance, at least in the opinion of the disciples. Obviously, Jesus never throws them out or treats them with disrespect. Then we also have the theme of discipleship, where Jesus asks the disciples to leave everything behind and come and follow him. Now, we also have an interesting comment about Jesus as the carpenter or the craftsman in Mark chapter 6, verses 3, which indicates that Jesus really came from the lower echelons of the society and definitely was not part of the learned elite or the rich of his time. We also have some references to money and wealth in Mark's gospel. Disciples are generally not wealthy, but we do come across Levi, who is a toll collector and may have been a little bit better off than your regular craftsman. We also come across the young rich man who is unable to follow Jesus due to his wealth. Jesus also talks about the lure of wealth that suffocates the word that Jesus preaches about the kingdom of God. In addition, we have some wealthier individuals such as Joseph of Arimathea and some of the scribes and Pharisees. And finally, we have tithes and taxes and payments that are scattered throughout the gospel. And finally, we have other passages about money, such as woman with the costly perfume and Judas who betrays Jesus for money. So let's look at our first theme in Mark's gospel, possessions and discipleship. As you can see, there are many texts regarding this topic, but we'll look at only some of them. So here's the familiar scene of Jesus calling his first disciples. As he was going along by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net in the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. Going on a little further, he saw James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, who were also in the boat mending the nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and went away to follow him. This is obviously a familiar scene where Jesus calls two set of brothers to follow him. As you can see, there's a sense of immediacy in this calling, and without further ado, both of the brothers they leave all that they have, their nets, and they start following Jesus. The narrative doesn't really give a whole lot of background information, nor does it give much of the context for this scene. Later on, Jesus sends the 12 out and he tells them to take nothing for the journey, only staff, shoes, and only one tunic. And based on this and other sections in the gospel, many would consider that the disciples actually left not just their jobs, but also their possessions as they started to follow Jesus. This is also implied in chapter 10. Now, if the disciples really left everything behind to follow Jesus, these were really very strict demands in light of Torah. Only the Qumran community and cynic philosophers would have had some similar ideas. So in that sense, we can say that leaving everything behind and starting to follow an itinerant preacher, rabbi, or a prophet would not have been completely odd in the first century setting. Yet it would have been a very radical change from the ordinary life and ordinary working life to a religious and spiritual commitment to this person named Jesus. So the next call narrative is about Levi. As he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And it happened that he was reclining at the table in his house, and many tax collectors and sinners were dining with Jesus and his disciples. For there were many of them, and they were following him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why is he eating and drinking with the tax collectors and sinners?" After hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Notice here, Jesus passes by Levi at his toll collecting booth. Levi follows him as Jesus tells him to follow me. But then later on, we hear that Jesus was reclining at the table in Levi's house, and there were many tax collectors and sinners there eating and dining with Jesus and the disciples. Now, the scene in itself must have been very offensive to the religious leaders. However, did Levi literally leave everything behind? Because if you look at the narrative, Levi seems to leave everything and then follow Jesus. But in the verse 15, they are now reclining and eating at Levi's house. So does leaving everything behind in this particular passage mean that Levi sold everything, all of his possessions, perhaps later, or did he give them to his relatives just to perhaps oversee that while he was traveling with Jesus? Or is this perhaps a narrative displacement, meaning that perhaps the dining happened prior to Levi meeting Jesus and Jesus telling him the words, "Follow me"? Another option is that Levi actually did not sell anything, did not get rid of any of his possessions, but he only left his earthly job as a toll collector and started to follow Jesus while retaining his possessions, perhaps just leaving them behind physically, but not economically. Now, all of these different options are actually rather possible in light of the little information that we have at hand in this particular passage. It seems to me, though, that the point of this passage is that Levi started to follow Jesus. Whatever happened to his house or possessions is not the most important part of it. So let's look at the third example about Jesus and discipleship in Mark's Gospel. In our previous teaching, we already looked at the rich man who wanted to follow Jesus, but was unable to do so because of his many possessions. We also briefly looked at how that passage has been read and interpreted differently throughout the church history. I'm sure you remember the story, but let me just go over the outline very quickly. There's a rich man who came to Jesus and asked him, "What should I do to inherit the eternal life?" And Jesus replied to him that you know the commandments, and then he lists some of the 10 commandments. And then he looks at Jesus, and the man says that he has fulfilled all the commandments since his youth. But then Jesus tells him that there's one thing that he lacks. Sell everything that you have and give to the poor, and then come and follow me. Having heard that, the rich man looks at Jesus, sad, and leaves, since he had many possessions and he was unable to let go of them. This is then followed by a discussion between Jesus and disciples about how difficult it is for rich people to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So this man is wealthy and he's unwilling to depart from his possessions and to follow Jesus. The wealth, according to this passage, is to be given by this man to the poor, not to the synagogue, not to the temple, not to the church, even though it could have been done through any of those means, possibly as well. Jesus also does not deny that this man has kept the Torah. Jesus is not trying to evaluate whether he had kept them perfectly, and there's no discussion of that sort. However, we can see that there was something more radically wrong with this rich man. He had forgotten the first tablet, or the first part of the 10 commandments, which states that you should have no other gods before me. His wealth had become his God, and he did not even realize it. Even the Qumran and the rabbis, when they talked about loving God with all your heart, strength, mind, and your neighbor as yourself, they acknowledged that loving God with all one's strength meant that loving God with all one's wealth. Certainly, this young man was unable to love God with all of his strength, and he was not able to say goodbye to his possessions, and his wealth had actually become an idol for him. And that is the reason why the man is appalled, and he goes away sad. He knows that he's wealthy, and he's unwilling to divest of his possessions and follow Jesus. After the man leaves, there ensues a discussion between Jesus and the disciples, and he generalizes the demands of the discipleship. And he says how hard it is for rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. In fact, it is easier for a camel to go through a needle than the rich person to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And at this, disciples are extremely perplexed, especially in light of the Torah commandments, which never detailed that one should get rid of all of his or her possessions. Interestingly, some of the later scribes make a slight textual correction, or perhaps better to say corruption, to make this saying a little bit more palatable. Instead of having the camel go through a needle, they changed the word into rope going through a needle. Now, you can't really push a rope through a needle either, but certainly that seems to be at least a little bit easier than the camel. Of course, the point is that things that are impossible for human beings are possible for God. As Jesus talks about God's power and the fact that what is impossible with human beings is possible with God, points out that it's not the patience or the mercy or the goodwill that is called upon, but it is God's power, and only God's power, that can change a person who is enamored with his or her riches. Demands of the discipleship here are not softened. They're not made more practical or more palatable. Quite the contrary. This teaching shows that wealth is nearly insuperable obstacle for discipleship, and only God's power is able to break the bondage of wealth and idolatry. Of course, the disciples respond and are very perplexed. Jesus' call for the disciples and for this rich young man is concrete. He tells him to leave and follow Jesus. It's not about inner detachment. It's not about giving something a little bit away, but it's actually leaving everything and following Jesus. At least in that sense, Clement of Alexandria's sermon on this passage is quite off the mark. While that might be a larger teaching in the entire scripture that one should be detached from the wealth, but this particular passage is not just teaching about inner detachment. Peter's response, "We have left everything," includes two things. Number one, it indicates that Peter and the disciples had left everything in a very concrete and specific sense. They had imitated what the rich man should have done. In other words, they had left everything to follow Jesus and probably also sold everything. Two, they also had joined a community of discipleship, those who followed Jesus. And since the disciples, first the 12 and then the larger community of disciples, formed a community, the promise of Jesus of hundredfold blessing, not only in the age to come, but in this life, should be seen in light of this communal sharing. It only makes sense to think that one will receive hundredfold of brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, because nobody can have 100 mothers and fathers unless they are spiritual ones. We see another example in the early chapters of Acts of Apostles, where all the believers came together and shared their possessions. Disciples were also taught to permanently rely on God in light of the promised blessing and also in light of the promised persecution. We can see that kingdom demands everything according to Jesus' teaching, and that wealth is an insurmountable obstacle, and it can only be surmounted by God's help. It can be overcome by God's help and God's power alone. The lure of wealth is constantly before the eyes of disciples. There's deceitfulness of riches and lure for things that Jesus already mentioned in the parable of the seed and the sower. Discipleship may actually require total divestiture, total dispossession of all that one has. Now, this may not be the case for every single individual, but one should also not rule out the possibility that Jesus is calling somebody to leave behind all that they have, not only in the ancient context, but perhaps even today. Only the way of the cross and death leads to life in Jesus' teaching. Here's a quote from one modern day saint, if you will, from India, who lived in the late 800s and early 1900s. He converted into Christianity from Sikhism in North India and literally left all that he had and followed Jesus. And he became, in his life, a sort of an example, an embodiment. What does it mean to leave everything behind and follow Jesus? So here's one of his, from one of his writings. He says, "I'm not worthy to follow in the steps of my Lord," he said. "But like him, I want no home, no possessions. Like him, I will belong to the road, sharing the sufferings of my people, eating with those who will give me shelter, and telling all people of the love of God." If we look at Mark's gospel as a whole and the discipleship process, we can see that some, according to Mark's gospel, left everything to follow Jesus, while others, some kingdom people, did not divest of everything. For example, Joseph of Arimathea, he did give his tomb for Jesus to be buried, but he did not leave everything to follow Jesus, as far as we can tell. We looked at the disciple Levi, and we were not really sure whether he left everything or not. But potentially he did not leave or sell everything that he owned, even though he started to physically follow Jesus. We have other examples, such as Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, who had some doubts and faith, and we're not told that he would have left everything to follow Jesus. So we can see that we can look at Mark's gospel and see 3 different levels of discipleship, and the levels are based on one's calling, not based on one's goodness, righteousness, or ability, but based on how Jesus calls. So we can see that the 12 disciples, they left everything for itinerant lifestyle with Jesus. So this leaving everything behind, and most possibly also selling, was only for the 12 disciples. The rich man who failed to do this because of his riches also was possibly called into this kind of itinerant lifestyle of physically, tangibly, and concretely following Jesus to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal and to minister to the people. Then we also have some which we could call the semi-sedentary disciples, some who followed Jesus here and there for some stretches of their journey, but were never called to follow Jesus as a full-time vocation. We also see some of the sympathizers and supporters who may have followed Jesus from time to time, but were never called into that full-time vocational following of Jesus. So we can conclude that Jesus called each one, and people were supposed to reflect and respond according to Jesus's call to each individual. And only very few were actually called to leave everything behind to follow Jesus. We could also ask ourselves, why did Jesus require poverty of his disciples? Probably because he wanted them to be totally devoted to God and to the kingdom proclamation. They were to have faith and trust in God and his provision, and also to trust in Jesus. It was perhaps also a symbolic action of solidarity with the poor. In the same way as the Old Testament prophets acted out the kingdom of God and his words, so the disciples were also to act out God's love and solidarity and help and compassion towards the poor, the marginalized, and the needy. And within the framework of Mark's gospel, discipleship is associated with carrying the cross, following Jesus all the way to death. And that is also an important part why the disciples were required to live a life of poverty as they followed Jesus. So next we are going to look at our second theme, duties to God and authorities. And first we will look at the familiar text when Jesus is asked whether he should pay taxes to Caesar. Then they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to him in order to trap him in a statement. They came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you're truthful and defer to no one, for you're not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay poll tax to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay?" But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to him, "Why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius to look at." They brought one, and he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." And Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things of God." And they were amazed at him. So the question here is obviously, is Jesus saying that one should pay taxes without question? Or what is the primary context of the passage? We can obviously see that the background is that the Pharisees and Herodians are trying to trap him. And they're trying to bring false charges against Jesus. Of course, the matter of taxes is always controversial, but even more so during Jesus' time. The question is about the direct taxes that were really associated with the subjugation and exploitation of the Romans against the Jewish people of the time. So the Pharisees come to Jesus and they use the flattering word teacher, and they tried to trap him. Now, without question, there was an alliance of politics and a religion here. As we can see, Pharisees, who were the lay people, associated with the Herodians, who were the sympathizers of King Herod. Now, Jesus has two possible answers to the question of whether one should pay taxes. He could say that, well, let's give the taxes and pay them without question to the emperor. The result would be that he would lose credibility both as a person and as a religious leader, prophet, and rabbi. And certainly he would lose followers. If he would say, don't pay taxes to the emperor, that would be considered tantamount to insurrection and would most likely secure Jesus' immediate arrest and possibly execution. Now, obviously, Jesus had already said that he will die at the hands of the Roman and Jewish leaders, but now was not yet the time. So Jesus asked for a coin because the tax was to be paid in denarii. So he has a visual aid to illustrate his answer. Now, coins were not just a sort of a money that we think of perhaps today. Coins were like portable billboards of Roman propaganda, since they carried the picture of the Roman emperor who was considered to be a son of God. As such, being under the Roman rule was not just a political inconvenience or even exploitation, but images of divine emperor among the Jewish people, especially the pious ones, was considered blasphemous. Now, as is well known, Jesus avoids a direct either or answer. But we should still ponder a little bit what is the relationship between the two clauses. Render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and render to God what belongs to God. Who is the priority? Are these two in happy harmony? Are they in conflict? Is it subversive or something like that? The clause could be understood that pay nothing, since everything, including money, land, and all belongs to God. Or it could be understood at pay taxes, since Caesar does God's will and should be honored as such. Of course, we see also in the Old Testament similar ideas that Israel at times should accommodate the rule of the foreigners, such as in the book of Jeremiah. Or it could be understood that pay taxes to Caesar while acknowledging the ultimate loyalty to God. And obviously, the final option seems to be the most accurate one. Jesus upholds paying the poll tax, but also, note this is very important, any taxes or any payment is upheld within the framework of God's ultimate and also superior authority. And as such, Jesus prohibits unquestioning loyalty to Rome. As far as Jesus was concerned, it will eventually fall, as will every other empire that is not from God. Thus, it is only God's kingdom or God's empire, God's kingly rule, not the Roman Empire or any other earthly empire that reigns supreme. In other words, render to Caesar what is due to him, but keep in mind that God has the ultimate authority. He is the one that you should always worship and always trust in him rather than any earthly authorities. Let's look at next about two sections that talk about religious exploitation. You can see here a familiar passage from Mark chapter 12. In his teaching, he was saying, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at the banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance's sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation." Now, I pause there, and I'd like to ask you, do you remember what passage follows? The reason is probably because we're not familiar with the connections between the two stories. Obviously, the first part of the passage talks about how Jesus warns his disciples about the scribes who like people to see them and to be honorable and have the best seats in the synagogues and the banquets, but yet at the same time devour widows' houses and say long prayers for the sake of it. Let's read what follows. "And he sat down opposite the treasury and began observing how people were putting money into the treasury. And many rich people were putting in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which amounted to a cent. And calling his disciples to him, he said to them, 'Truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all the contributors to the treasury. For they all put in out of their surplus, but she out of her poverty put in all she owned, all she had to live on.'" Can you see that there is a connection between the two stories? And we can see that both talk about or mention religious places such as synagogue and the temple, and both mention the widow or a widow. We could ask ourselves, how are the scribes characterized? What follows this story, and what are the connections between this story and the chapter 13? You probably are used to reading chapter 12 and 13 as 2 separate stories, but there might also be a connection. Read chapter 13 or the beginning part of it and see if you can figure out the connection. This story obviously characterizes the deeds of the scribes. They have clothes and lifestyle of wealth and honor and apparent religious devotion. Yet at the same time, they exploit widows through devouring. Remember, that word devouring occurs many times in the Old Testament prophets, how the rich devour the poor. Now, how is the story of the widows might related to the earlier story, or that of the scribe who was characterized as one who devours widows? One of my friends actually asked a real, true African widow about her opinion of the story. Let's see what she said about this. "Everyday life is difficult, especially for those who don't have children. There are many like me that live in this village because AIDS has killed many here. Some elderly to care for the grandchildren. It is very difficult. Nobody cares for the elderly. One does not even have the 2 small coins that the story refers to. And if one manages to get the coins, so there's immediately someone who grabs them. There are taxes even though we don't have food. Yes, we do have rich people here as well, who build expensive houses and cities, buy cars, and travel overseas. It is good that Jesus focuses on widows like us." The widow in Africa understands how important it is for Jesus to note her. The plight of poverty and exploitation, and how Jesus actually focuses on her. But there's more to this story that we can also glean from this African widow's interpretation, at least partially as well. We could ask ourselves, is Jesus just feeling compassion and perhaps sorry for the widow, or is he saying something more than that? Now, in the ancient world, women were not able to be property owners, especially in the land of Israel. So when the widow gave the 2 small copper coins, she gave literally all that she had. With the 2 lepta, or 2 small copper coins, she could have bought a handful of flours for one meager meal, but that's it. Now, we're told that the widow put her 2 small copper coins into the temple treasury. Now, what was that for? Most likely it's one of the 13 trumpet-shaped containers that pilgrims and people who went to the temple could put coins in. Some of them had specific purpose. Very often it was to build the temple to be even greater and more magnificent, and other purposes would have been free will offerings. Did Jesus then commend her sacrificial giving like we are used to interpreting this passage? When Jesus said that she gave all that she had, or did Jesus proclaim the exploitative nature of the temple system when he said she gave all that she had? Previous section, remember, is about the scribes who were specifically associated with the temple. They were the ones who were devouring widows' houses, and they were exploiting the widows. Could this be also understood as a sort of a religious exploitation for the temple building fund and all other sorts of religious extravaganza? Well, did you read what Mark chapter 13 says? Would that have any implications for the interpretation of this passage? Well, let's read what the chapter 13 says. And obviously it's the passage about the destruction of the temple. As he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." So the saying about the widow in the temple putting her money into the temple treasury is followed by a saying where Jesus says that this whole temple will be judged and torn down despite its beautiful looks and grandeur. Additional passage that we can see is from a Jewish historian, Josephus, who also wrote about the corruption of the temple and the priesthood. He says that, "And such was the impudence and boldness that had seized one of the high priests, that they had the hardness to send their servants into the threshing floors, to take away those tithes that were due to the priests, insomuch that it so fell out that the poorer sort of priests died for want." What Josephus is saying here is that the high priest, the elite priest who had the power and control over the temple, had seized and robbed the tithes from the priests who were the more ordinary people, so much so that they didn't have anything to eat and they actually starved to death. Both of these incidents, including the previous saying, discusses and indicates the corruption of the temple and how it was used as a means of exploitation. So we could also see that Jesus was highly critical of the temple and rebuking its exploitative nature. Later on, as we remember, Jesus rebuked the temple and called it the den of robbers. And at the same time, when he turned over the moneylender's table, he acted out its demise and judgment. And as a result, the chief priests and the scribes wanted to kill him. If you have gone through the PowerPoints regarding the Old Testament, you can go back and perhaps remind yourself of Jeremiah's temple sermon in Jeremiah chapter 7. And here Jesus is exactly doing the same thing. He's giving a prophetic critique and judgment on the temple, as he calls it, den of robbers, quoting both Jeremiah and then later on Isaiah. Jesus had earlier already criticized Pharisees of exploiting their elderly parents and neglecting them for the sake of offerings to God. In other words, if we look at this saying of Jesus about the widow, the widow's mite, and the scribes who are devouring the widows, we could conclude that Jesus, when he is speaking those words that the widow gave all that she had, it could be also understood that Jesus is speaking out loud the words towards the audience who would be also scribes and Pharisees, and he shames them and all the rest of the wealthy donors publicly, and at the same time he lifts the poor widow up. He exposes the corrupt system of the temple and its religious exploitation. And he rebukes the leaders of the temple. And he also hints at its destruction, which to his disciples, he then directly announces. In all of this, Jesus aligns himself with the Old Testament prophets, not just Jeremiah, but others as well. As always, human need takes precedence over religiosity, as we saw so clearly in the book of Amos and Micah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. Of course, much more could be said about wealth, poverty, money, and possession in Mark's gospel, but let me conclude. Total commitment to Jesus is the most important in light of God's kingdom in Mark's gospel. Wealth can be and is an insurmountable obstacle for many who want to follow Jesus. And this obstacle can only be overcome by God's power. Jesus exposes and condemns all sorts of exploitation that is based on religion or false worship, hypocrisy, or any of that sort of things. Love of God, love of fellow human beings always takes precedence over specific religious rules or rituals. God should always have one's ultimate loyalty. While government and civic authorities are important, and as Paul says, even God-given, they are often corrupt. And even so, when we give our loyalty to them, it should always be a secondary. Our ultimate loyalty should always be to God. But at the same time, when we say that we give our ultimate loyalty to God, it never indicates that one should be an advocate for armed revolution of any sort. Finally, Jesus in Mark's gospel is not just recommending doing good and helping the poor. It is an indispensable part of duties that Jesus's followers have. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to put some comments below.